Good evening, and welcome to Afro Solo TV. We're here again this evening with a wonderful guest to talk about what's happening in the black art scene here in the San Francisco Bay Area. Now, I don't like to talk a lot about our guest until they introduce themselves, so I'll just say, welcome, Mr. Guest.
Thank you.
We have Marvin K. White. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
Well, it's a treat to have you here. Now, as I said, often we don't say a lot about the poets because I could talk about you for 20 or 30 minutes. But we let people introduce themselves.
Okay.
So if someone were to say, who is Mr. Marvin K. White, what would you say?
Well, I would tell them that a Bay Area son. I am Oakland born and raised. I have been making art in the Bay Area since I was a child, influenced by Bay Area culture. I'm a child of the melting pot that is the Bay Area, so my influences are wide and varied. And I continue to be excited about making art here.
How did you get started
You know,
in your world or in the world of art?
I think people, might have saw something different in me. All my brothers were athletes, and really three-letter athletes, including my sister, and I was the oddball, and needed some other way to shine. So I became, purposely a bookworm, and really went in the other direction. And there were a couple people who just, it seemed like every few years gave me something creative to do. Somebody gave me a guitar once, somebody gave me bongos once. People were always giving me books, and finally, I remember in junior high there was a poetry contest, and I wrote a poem and I got praised for it, and it was like it planted a seed. And I've always known I was creative, but that was the first time it crystallized into like, oh, there's a such thing as a writer. So
Now, do you remember that first poem?
I do not. I do not. I do remember something about cougars flying off into the sky or something like that. But what I do remember is, my grandmother had a cup on the little curio shelf that grandmothers have, and there was a little ditty on the cup that said the rooster to the hen, "You haven't laid an egg since God knows when." Said the hen to the rooster, "Well, you don't come around as much as you used to." And it stuck. It stuck in my head. And I really think that rhythm and that sense of humor, and her having this place of honor for this little limerick on her shelf really stuck with me. I don't even think she knew that she influenced me that way, but and I must have been like 6 or 7.
Yeah, and it's kind of amazing how small things like
Yeah,
that
yeah,
can have a real big
yeah,
impact.
yeah, and particularly with I come from women, and um, it's important for me as a writer to remember the small things. There were some big sweeping gestures, the way they got everybody from Louisiana, but it's also important that I remember the cup on the curio cabinet shelf, and the way she cocked her head, and the way she cooked, and the way she walked, and the way she looked at people, and the way people felt and looked at her when they saw her. So
So, do you remember the first time you recited a poem? Or did you recite that poem in public?
I
What was the first time you did a public performance of a poem?
Yeah, I don't think that one was recited. There's always been performance-based stuff. We did the Wiz when I was in 6th grade, and I was a scarecrow. That's a whole nother show. And I really think the as a writer and as a poet, the moments that stand out as the ones that started to make it all make sense didn't happen until I was like in my 20s. Yeah.
Now, while you were on that growing plane to get to that,
Yes.
did you take lessons? Writing
No,
lessons or poetry?
no formal writing. I've always been a reader, and I've always been involved in workshops as an adult at least. But no, I was in band in junior high school, and I played the saxophone for a semester, and I learned 2 notes. And but no real training. My formal training didn't happen until like I said, became an adult writer.
And was that the formal training was in the form of workshops,
In the
but
form of
also
workshops.
doing a lot of reading?
A lot of readings and a lot of workshops. I moved to New York when I was 21, and I met a group of black black gay men who were writers,
Mm-hmm.
and they were telling these bold, amazing stories, and they weren't just telling stories. They were having workshops, and we were talking about craft and meter and rhyme, and
Mm-hmm.
they were talking about literary lineage, and
Mm-hmm.
you write like this person, you come from this person.
Mm-hmm.
I don't care if you've never studied them, because you're from the South and because you came to Oakland and because you ended up in New York,
Mm-hmm.
this rhythm follows you and precedes you, and you don't have a choice but to write like this. And so they helped me to trace myself back as a writer,
Mm-hmm.
and it just, like I said, in that moment, it just made sense.
Mm-hmm. Now, we've talked about your work as a poet and
Mm-hmm.
you as a poet,
Mm-hmm.
but you said you were a musician, which I didn't know. A
Right.
saxophone player, you got your two
Right.
notes.
You're
You still
you're
got your two
you're
notes?
being very kind. You're very
Now, in terms of, I know you've performed on
Mm,
stage
yes,
as an actor.
yes.
Did you do any training for acting, or was that sort of learning as you went
Yeah,
and did
that
it, or?
yeah, that was also a learning as I went.
Mm-hmm.
I've, like I said, I've always been creative, and I've always dabbled in performance, and have always had that bone. And you know, I've studied people who are charismatic and who also are really good actors. And I'm a media buff, TV, film, and stage, and and I write stories. So there's a way that I can inhabit a story naturally, and so it came naturally, to be able to do that kind of stuff.
So, in some ways, we talk about people having PhDs in life,
Mm-hmm.
in real
Yeah.
world.
Mm-hmm.
So, in some ways, it seems like a lot of what you've learned is from living,
Yeah.
which may be the best
Yeah.
teacher.
Yeah. And I love the path, that we all take. I love my friends who are PhDs now, who have literally been in school since they were in kindergarten, and the amount of knowledge that they have is just amazing. But they respect, my path as well, and know that, me being out in the world and being creative and building community and learning as I go is also a valid way to learn and make art.
Most
Yeah.
definitely. In talking about some of your friends
Mm-hmm.
who have PhDs
Mm-hmm.
now, who are some of the people that you idolize
Mm-hmm.
or you respect? Who
Mm-hmm.
do you look up to, or who have been some of the people that have helped influence you?
Yeah, early on, there were always, I think we all had to, you know, read some Maya Angelou, and she was the first, writer I read whose story sounded like the women that I came from, and while it was complex, it wasn't complicated, and you didn't have to read it necessarily for meaning. You could read it for head nod and rhythm, and just to be able to close your eyes and connect to it. So it was definitely her, and I love black women writers. Sonia Sanchez and Gwendolyn Brooks, and some of the men writers from Essex Hemphill to Osoto Saint, brothers who've passed already, but who invited me to write.
Wow, so you work with them personally?
Yes, yes, yes.
And what influence do you feel that they had on you? I know Hemphill, he passed away a number of years
Yeah,
ago.
yeah, yeah, yeah. They both, you know, knew that it was important to tell our story. There's this philosophy that says, you can't leave it up to history to tell your story, because history will get you wrong, or history will exclude you, or history will just leave you out, or make you a footnote. And you owe it to yourself to make sure that if there's going to be a story about you, that you tell the story.
Wow. That's in some ways how Afro Solo started,
Hmm.
with me in some ways trying to provide a forum for me to tell my story,
Yeah.
but also a forum for other African Americans and people of an African ancestry to tell our stories
Right.
from an authentic point of view.
Right, right, right,
So I think that he was absolutely correct in saying that.
right. And our stories are often, precarious. When my grandmother and my mom both had Alzheimer's, and I'm not even talking about the social, economic, ways in which we can't hold on to things, but physically they weren't able to hold on to stories, and I had to grab on to it, because no one else in my family were stepping up to take control of these stories and to hold on to them in a way that is written.